Rejecting Black Lives Matter as a movement isn't rejecting the idea that Black Lives matter. Have a more comprehensive view of what makes Black Lives matter, and then get off your butt and go do something about it.
What's up, guys? This is Will Witt with PragerU. Riots, coronavirus, protests. It's been a crazy time in America, so I'm sitting down with an expert to talk about what's going on and how we can heal and fix it.
My name is Derryck Green. I'm a writer, and I've done a lot of research on the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and Black Lives Matter.
I want to thank you so much for joining us, Derryck, today. Across the country right now, we've seen horrible riots, looting, protesters, all about George Floyd's death. And now you have these people going and they're doing it for police violence, police brutality. But in your opinion, is police brutality, police violence really that big of an issue in the Black community that people should be doing this?
It's interesting. I think police brutality is an issue, and I think it should be properly addressed. I think that anytime you have the police acting in ways that are unprofessional, especially in a case like George Floyd, where a lot of people think that his life was lost because of what the officer did, justice is called for, and I think people should rightly protest for that. But in terms of the Black communities, I think there are a lot more pressing issues that should probably be prioritized above the issue of police brutality if we're serious about changing the way Black communities are lived in the country currently. Again, it's not to say that George Floyd's death, we should trivialize it in any way, shape, or form, or anybody's death at the hands of police officers. Again, justice should be rightly meted out. But again, there's so many other issues that make more of a pressing concern on Black families and on Black lives and in Black communities that I think that we need to kind of put those in proper position and take those ones in order of importance to have a very tangible, positive effect on Black communities.
Yeah, it's like if Black lives really mattered to the organization Black Lives Matter, they'd be focusing on issues that have really hurt African Americans in America for a long time.
Right.
In your opinion, what are some of the most prominent issues that should be addressed?
The idea of the Black Lives Matter movement, this movement is very, very narrowly focused on the issue of police brutality. Now, you can look at the FBI Uniform Crime Report, or you can look at the Washington Post, and you can see some of the numbers of unarmed Blacks who are killed by police each year. That's almost a statistical zero. Again, it's not to trivialize the lives that were lost, but we need to put it in proper context. If we're going to talk about if or not Black Lives Matter, we need to have a more comprehensive approach to it. There's a lot of other issues that should take precedence. One of those issues, in my personal opinion, are Black marriage rates. Black marriage rates are under 30%, where the nationwide marriage rates are about 50%. Another issue that would actually have an immediate effect on Black lives and improving Black lives would be Black parents having children within the context of marriage. Another issue is education. A lot of Black people complain about the sorry state of public education and how Black children have been underserved in substandard schooling for 50 plus years, particularly in the inner cities. Well, if Black lives really matter, why are we not doing everything in our power? Or why is this movement not doing everything in its power to improve access to quality education for these Black children? We can talk about economics, the regulations that prevent business owners and large businesses from hiring people to get them into the workforce. A lot of people are protesting and picketing, wanting to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And that's really, really good for people who are lucky enough to be employed, but also lucky enough to stay employed once that's implemented. But if you have somebody who's low skill, no skill, who's also a victim of substandard education, $15 an hour prices him out of the market. So again, if we want to talk about how Black Lives Matter, let's look at the picture as a whole and see what some of these issues that we can directly address and force some of these politicians and elected leaders to say, listen, it's easy to put a black square on social media, but let's force them to demonstrate that Black lives actually matter by reducing government to allow Blacks to thrive and to develop and flourish.
That's a whole myriad of problems that when you look at Black Lives Matter right now, what they're saying on the streets, rioting, that is not at all what they're saying. They're saying whatsoever. To defund the police, and that's really their main goal. And you have these white Antifa members who are saying they support Black Lives Matter. They're going out on the streets and they're destroying Black businesses. There's the one with the sports bar. How do you see these riots and the protesting even negatively affecting the Black community?
Well, I don't think riots and protests are constructive. They said that they started with nonviolent protests after the death of George Floyd, but they quickly escalated to pillaging, burning, looting, vandalism. These kinds of things distract from the issue at hand. And so whether it's Antifa or anybody else who are just racial or social opportunists who are coming into these protests to take advantage of the situation, Black Lives Matter actually had an obligation to shut that down at the very beginning, because if they were serious about justice for George Floyd and serious about justice for other victims of police brutality, riots don't do anything for your cause. They actually turn people who would otherwise listen to your cries and your pleas for justice and then support you, you turn them away. They start to resent you after that. And so Black Lives Matter should have done a lot more in the very beginning to marginalize Antifa and bring attention to what Antifa was doing, whether it's destroying Black businesses or destroying neighborhoods that are predominantly Black. A lot of people complain that a lot of businesses don't want to go into disproportionately Black areas, particularly when they're low income. Well, these are the reasons why. It costs a lot of money to open it up in these kinds of areas, but then when you go in and destroy them, who's going to want to come back in these particular areas knowing that it's a tinderbox that's ready to explode? But it's the business owners and the people who are in these communities who can't leave these communities once these protests and riots and demonstrations are over. It just undermined their cause. Whatever moral authority that they had at the very beginning, by not shutting it down, it undermined all of that. And you can't wait until you're being blamed for these businesses being looted and vandalized. You have to shut that off at the very beginning, because a lot of these people whose businesses were vandalized may have been susceptible to Black Lives Matter messages with respect to George Floyd.
It's crazy to me that it's like that because I'm a conservative, or more or less, that people come and they say, oh, because I don't support the organization Black Lives Matter, they say, oh, you don't think Black Lives Matter. It's like, of course I think all lives matter, Black Lives Matter, everyone, you know what I mean?
Sure.
That's the point. It's how the left works. We can all say that there's a problem, like whether it's climate change, we agree that climate change is happening, whatever it might be. But if you don't have the same solution as them, which for this particular case, which is the rioting, the protesting, you know, freaking out, then you're a bigot or you don't agree with it. What do you think are the real solutions to fixing this?
It's a tough question. It's a good question. It's a tough question. First off, this is what happens, is that the left frames the parameters of the debate and they force you to fall within those parameters. And if you don't, then you are not alongside them, you're not with them, you're evil, these kinds of things. I think that, again, to your point, if we really want to demonstrate that Black Lives Matter, there's a myriad of other issues that we can go directly talk to. Again, people can say, listen, I'm 100%. And this is interesting because this is one of the instances of police brutality where it seemed like the left and the right were in almost unanimity in agreement that this was a travesty and he should have been fired and arrested. But that wasn't enough. So they go into rioting, they go into pillaging. And it's just, if they're really serious about helping these people in these communities, they should say we shouldn't riot, because one way Black Lives Matter is that a lot of these people who live in these communities work at these businesses that were damaged. So I've seen a lot of people on social media saying, well, why are you talking about material property? There's a human life here. And it's kind of the same argument that I heard during COVID, right? These businesses will come back. Well, we don't know if those businesses will come back after an extended period of time. And a lot of these businesses that were damaged in these protests were almost about to open because they were releasing people to go back to their lives and reclaim a bit of normalcy. Well, they took that from them. So now the people who've been out of work for 2, 3, 4 weeks or 8 weeks, now are going to be out of work for even longer because these businesses have to go clean up the glass, restock these things. It costs a lot of money. How do you control costs? The easiest cost when you're in business is labor costs. It's the one thing that you can immediately have a direct effect upon. And I think it's just a lot of misguided intentions from Black Lives Matter and their supporters. I think it's more of a political movement to try to create chaos and to use Black rage and white guilt to achieve their aims.
Something I've been thinking about is affirmative action. How affirmative action is pretty much inherently racist, where it's basically saying Black people, Hispanic people, oh, you're not as smart as white people,
right? So
we have to give you a leg up.
That's
right now, we have, I don't know if you saw this video on Twitter where you have all at the protest, you have all these white people, they come and they're kneeling and they're like all apologizing to all these Black people. To me, that that's almost racism in itself. You know what I mean? It's like you are putting African Americans back years and years of all the progress that they've made to integrate themselves into our society, and then it's like you are separating them again.
Yes.
You know, it's like a segregation almost.
Sure.
What do you think about that?
It's funny, you know, affirmative action and Black Lives Matter kind of work the same way. People always ask me, you know, do you think affirmative action will ever end? And at one point in my life, I was optimistic. I was like, sure, it's got to end eventually. But then I realized that affirmative action and now Black Lives Matter, probably these kinds of movements at least, won't end in my lifetime, because affirmative action and Black Lives Matter are two ready-made vehicles that white people can glom onto and support to disprove their racism in advance. So they can separate themselves from the sin and stigma of racism by supporting these two movements, however counterproductive they are. Affirmative action really says you're not good enough. If not for coerced government intervention, you would never be successful. Okay, so how does that work exactly? What you're doing is saying we're going to give you help. We're going to give you a handout at the expense of Black development. It constrains Black flourishing, and then it stigmatizes our development, because now everything that we accomplish has the stigma of lower standards and being helped into it. So now we can never rest assured that what we've been able to accomplish was on our own merits. You know, Black Lives Matter is the same way. It's saying, oh, you have all these people genuflecting and kneeling. It's so patronizing to kneel, because what it says is that we can't deal with a Black person like regular human beings. We have to treat them like children because we don't think that they're emotionally mature enough to deal with life separate and distinct from race. Not saying we should ignore it, but just simply separate and distinct. So we have to kneel. We have to show them that we're not racist. It's almost like walking up to a Black person and patting them on the head. That's offensive to me. So I don't think that white people should get in the habit of kneeling unless they're going to be engaging in prayer. You can kneel with your fellow Black people if you're going to engage in prayer, but don't get out of this idea of this racial deference that you're kind of, going down to their level, because white groveling doesn't solve the problem. What it does is it shows weakness. Now, the people that are groveling, Black people see that and they see more white weakness. They see more white guilt. So white guilt, and Shelby Still wrote about this about 30 years ago, white guilt is the leverage to Black power. With the lack of white guilt, Black power, if we've seen it with Black Lives Matter or any so-called racial justice movements, ceases to have the kind of power that it has now. We should stop that. We should treat one another the same way. I know people don't like to talk about color blindness because they get offended. You're ignoring a central part of my identity. But at some point, we want to treat Blacks as equals. If you reduce affirmative action and let us compete, we can demonstrate that we are equal with our counterparts. When you talk to us mutually, that says to me that you're treating me as your peer, not some subordinate that isn't capable of meeting or exceeding the same mental, intellectual, or emotional standards that people expect of you. I just want to be treated equally. And I think most Blacks want to be treated equally as people, not as children.
I think social media plays a big role in this that makes it very negative. I think we live in the generation of virtue signaling. I mean, 100%.
Cheap
if you go on my Instagram and everything, I'm very sarcastic and tongue-in-cheek with my jokes, because the pandering stuff is like, I hate that. I can't deal with it. And so just the other day, we saw all these people, all these white people all over my Instagram, all over everyone's Instagram, posting the black square, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And it's like, it doesn't seem to me to be a really genuine indication of like, oh, wow, you post this black square, I guess racism is solved now.
Right.
It's virtue signaling to make it so Black people will see them and say, oh, I'm not racist now.
That's right. You know what I mean? That's right. It's a proactive way of distancing themselves, like I said earlier, from the sin and stigma of being racist. White people have been, in the last 10 years, 20 years, have been in a situation where guilt has been thrust upon you and sin and evil has been thrust upon you because you are white. And you are a benefactor of white privilege. And if you left unchecked, you would expand white supremacy. So white people are in this, what I call this act of self-preservation, where they want to go out and prove that they're not like the other bad white racists that actually advocate white supremacy. But social media is a substitute for real activism. It's really easy to post a black square that means absolutely nothing. Compare the black square to Martin King and the elders of the civil rights movement that are marching in unison, knowing that at the end of the march or during the march, they're going to meet police batons. They're going to meet dogs. They're going to meet fire hoses, guns. But they still did it because the greater good was equality and sharing in the American dream, being considered part or protected under the U.S. Constitution, forcing the country to live up to the ideals that are articulated in the Declaration of Independence. They endured that. Thank God. If this generation, we were dependent on this generation for civil rights, we'd still be segregated because social media is a poor stand-in for actual activism. Why don't they, instead of posting a black square, go advocate for open access to better schools? That's very difficult to do because you know that the intimidation, the bully, you got to do actual work, and the threats of intimidation that come along with that as well. Why not advocate for blacks to be married and stay married? Why not advocate for a whole bunch of things? Why not do that? It's very difficult work, and I don't think that a lot of people have it within them to do that work. It's easy to sit on your couch, post something, and boom, and then see how many likes that you get. It's very, very easy, but it's not real activism. It's not constructive activism.
I also don't ever put a lot of blame on those people who put the black squares and stuff, a lot of them, because, it's the same with me doing my interviews on the streets talking to students, where I don't think they're stupid or dumb. They've just been so misinformed about a lot of things, so they don't necessarily have the answers on what to do, like talking about, open schools or keeping families together. Like, they don't even know that that's like a difference of opinion they could even have.
Right.
People, the lack of education is a really tough thing. But you're talking about the civil rights stuff before. What was the difference between the civil rights movement of like Martin Luther King versus like a Black Panthers type of movement, and which one are we seeing more analogous to what's going on today?
That's a good question. I've always said that Black Lives Matter is an ideological heir to the Black Power movement, because when you look at the civil rights movement, the most recognizable person obviously is Martin Luther King Jr. He was about nonviolence. He was about going and silently protesting, but not meeting violence with violence, because one of the strategies was that he said, if you meet violence with violence, people who are watching on TV, and he knew the power of television, they're not going to be able to make a moral distinction between those who are oppressed and those who are fighting to maintain that oppression. So if you meet violence with nonviolence, people have to make a moral distinction between one or the other, and then they have to decide who they want to choose. The second thing is that they wanted to integrate into American society this whole notion that they knew that the Declaration of Independence is beautifully written. The country simply didn't live up to its ideals, even with the Constitution. So he wanted to force the country to morally persuade them to live up to the ideals in the Declaration of Independence and the laws of the Constitution: integration, equality, and race neutrality. There was no intrinsic good or bad with race. It was neutral. Give us an opportunity. Let us prove that we are equal with the people who have been oppressing us for 100 years. So they, to me, had the moral authority, that and the fact that the civil rights movement was born and nurtured in Black churches. I think a lot of people forget that and forget how significant that was. The Black Power movement, on the other hand, said, no, we don't want race neutrality. We're going to redefine what it means to be Black, and then we want mainstream America to deal with us how we've redefined ourselves. The second thing is they wanted racial separatism. They didn't want integration. They wanted separatism. There was a lot of Black nationalism sentiment going on during this time in the Black consciousness period from 1968 to the early 70s. So you had the Black Panther movement. You had a bunch of other racial solidarity movements that were going on that were emphasizing the cultural identity and what it meant to be Black. And they were about violence. Again, this is the movement that adopted Malcolm X's phrase, by any means necessary. They didn't want to overcome, they wanted to overrun. And so they were going to meet violence with violence because of the frustrations of the younger radicals that were coming up in the Black Power movement. It's interesting when you look back historically, all of the wins happened because of the civil rights movement. The Black Power movement didn't really win anything legislatively. They didn't really convince anybody morally. They got some political concessions, but it was more social. And then they were kind of co-opted by the white left. Black Lives Matter is the same way. You can see when they're out there, they have the black fists up. Any type, the shops that are boarded up around any city, you see the black fist. They're Black Lives Matter. They're chanting the chants of Black Power from the late 1960s. There's just so much that they've borrowed from them. They're saying F the cops, die pigs. So they're a radical heir to the Black Power movement, and people have to make a decision. Rejecting Black Lives Matter as a movement isn't rejecting the quality and care for Black lives. It's rejecting the way they're going about doing what they're doing. If you really care for Black lives and you don't think that civil rights have been achieved, which I personally do, then think about your strategy. Adopt something that's going to be nonviolent. Morally persuade people. Don't instigate or offend people who would otherwise be receptive to your message and then help you achieve what you say you want to achieve. Black Lives Matter isn't doing that. They're not going to, in my opinion, they're not going to really convince anybody who doesn't already share their ideological presuppositions. So those are some of the things that I think separate Black Lives Matter and Black Power from the civil rights movement, and why people should look back historically and appreciate what was accomplished in such a very difficult time. I don't know if I even have the intestinal fortitude to peacefully march, knowing that I might be hit over the head with a baton like John Lewis was, or even ultimately killed like Martin Luther King. It's a really, those men and women of that era were extremely brave. The people that we're seeing out today, there's a lot of words that I would call them, and brave is not one of them.
Yeah. And I want to end with this. Speaking of bravery, as you were just talking about, we've seen Candace Owens be very brave, just speaking up and talking about stuff. A lot of other Black people talking about this and what's really going on. But there are tons of still Black people saying, Candace, when I was talking to her, messaging her and saying, I want to stand up, but I'm not brave enough to, or I don't have the courage to, even though I agree with things that you're saying. How do you suggest that these people actually stand up and be courageous, and what are the consequences if they don't?
It's kind of like what you were saying earlier, that when you interview some people, you don't necessarily hold it against them because this is probably all they know. Well, sometimes I don't hold it against other Blacks, particularly Blacks, but doesn't really matter the race. I don't necessarily hold it against them because they've had a lifetime, if they're my age, they've had a lifetime of seeing what happens to Blacks who make that stand. I'm old enough to remember what happened to Clarence Thomas. We know recently what happened to Kanye West when he came out and said whatever he said. The same thing with Ben Carson. Ben Carson was loved and adored by millions and millions of people until he decided to run for president as a Republican. And so people see the arrows and the bullets that a lot of people who are courageous receive, and they don't necessarily want to endure that. They also don't want to put their families in harm's way as well. But I would encourage them to stand up, because there truly is strength in numbers. As we've seen with these riots the last week, 2-3 people trying to go and riot and loot and pillage, that's not going to end well for them. But when you have 500 people going crazy, their strength, they know that the cops are going to stand down, at least for a certain point, so they're able to be successful the way they define it. Well, the same way goes with Blacks who think conservatively or just aren't on the left. Maybe they're an independent, but they agree with some of the things that are being said by other conservative Blacks. I would encourage them to stand out and stand with us, because the more of us there are, they won't be able to so easily pigeonhole us and intimidate us into silence. And I would actually say the same thing for white conservatives as well. I mean, listen, I get the whole idea of being demonized for being white. Believe me, I 100% understand that. But at the same time, if you can see the arrows that Black conservatives continue to endure, and a lot of them haven't renounced their conservatism, then you have no choice. You have to be courageous as well. If we can do it, you can do it. And we would love your help. It's our army would be much more effective if we had more people standing with us on the front lines to push back on what's happening culturally, politically, and socially by the left. So please be courageous, pray about it, think about it. If you choose not to because of whatever it may be, primarily because of your family, completely understand that. if you can't stand with us on the front line, at least give us encouragement on the DMs and the private messages. You know what I'm saying? So we know that there are other people out there who think like us and want us to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, you push against the group Black Lives Matter. If you think that Black lives actually matter, don't support the organization
Absolutely.
Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely. Rejecting Black Lives Matter as a movement isn't rejecting the idea that Black Lives matter. Have a more comprehensive view of what makes Black Lives matter, and then get off your butt and go do something about it.
Exactly. I appreciate this so much, Derryck. Thank you so much for being here, man.
Love it, man.
Everyone, this was a great interview. If you enjoyed this, make sure you share with your friends. I definitely learned something. Drop a comment about what you learned or what you liked about this. We're going to see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. What's up, guys? Thank you so much for watching this video. PragerU is a 501c3 organization. Help us keep our videos free by making a tax-deductible donation today. I'd really appreciate your support.